Reading today is 2 Corinthians 11, verse 16, till 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10. Paul boasts about his sufferings. I repeat, let no one take me for a fool, but if you do, then receive me just as you would a fool, so that I may do a little boasting. In this self-confident boasting, I'm not talking as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many are boasting in the way the world does, I too will boast. You gladly put up with fools, since you are so wise. In fact, you even put up with anyone who enslaves you or exploits you, or takes advantage of you, or pushes himself forward, or slaps you in the face. To my shame, I admit that we were too weak for that. What anyone else dares to boast about, I am speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast about. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am out of my mind to talk like this. I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in dangers from bandits, in dangers from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, who is to be praised forever, knows that I am not lying. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas had the city of the Damascenes guarded in order to arrest me. But I was lowered in a basket from a window in the wall and slipped through his hands. I must go on boasting. Although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise. He heard inexpressible things, things that man is not permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weaknesses. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say. To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I'm strong." Amen.
Right. The passage I was given today was actually twice as long as the one that Suzanne read for us, and thank you so much for reading that, because it was still a long passage, but it should have gone right into the end of 2 Corinthians, so there was another chapter and a half to go. And I thought that was really a bit too much. So I asked her just to read the first part, and that's the part I'm focusing on today. And I've got two main things I'm going to be talking about. One is boasting, and one is the grace of God. So if we have a look at the first part of the reading, Paul has been talking about boasting. And he's saying that as everyone else seems to be boasting according to human standards, he would do the same. And what anyone else dares to boast of, he would also boast of that. And then he gives a list of things which, by human standards, he could really boast about well. His birthright, his ancestry, being born into a prominent Jewish background. He was not only an Israelite and a descendant of Abraham, but he was a Hebrew. So that meant he was Hebrew speaking, writing Hebrew as well, as opposed to a Hellenistic Jew who would be Greek speaking. And they were sort of looked down, a little bit down on by those who are actually the Hebrew speaking Israelites. In his letter to Philippians, Paul adds to his credentials. He says, Philippians 3 verses 46, even though I too have reason for confidence in the flesh, if anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness, under the law, blameless. Paul had excellent Jewish credentials, but also with regards to following Christ, his credentials were excellent. In 2 Corinthians 11:23 he says, are they ministers? Talking about some of his opponents. I'm a better one, with far greater labours, far more imprisonments, with countless floggings. 5 times he'd received from the Jews 40 lashes, 3 times beaten with rods, stoned, shipwrecked, adrift at sea for day and a night, frequently in danger on his journeys, danger from bandits, from rivers, from Gentiles, from his own people, dangers in the city, in the wilderness. He went through loads of things. He was often hungry, had sleepless nights, was cold, naked. And on top of all of those weaknesses, which he could boast about, and those things he'd done for Christ and suffered for Christ, he also had the constant worry and anxiety of worrying for all the churches that he'd planted, that he'd set up. And then in chapter 12, he then also goes on to boast about the fact that he received revelations from God and visions from the Lord. If anyone could boast, he had far more he could boast about. But if we look at the culture at the time, it was actually fairly normal standard practice for someone to boast about their background. About their family, their achievements, their religious piety. It was customary to achieve glory and status in this life by boasting. Citizens and soldiers in the Greco-Roman world would, without embarrassment and as social convention, try to outdo each other in boasting of their military and political achievements. These would be listed on monuments, on public buildings, depicted on household murals, and sometimes set out in sort of epic narratives. But boasting was also commonplace among the Jews, particularly those of the religious leaders. So for the Pharisees in the temple, they would boast of their religious achievements. They'd boast about which rabbi they'd been trained by, and especially if they had been trained by one of the really prestigious ones, like Gamaliel. And we know from Acts chapter 22 that Paul was educated in the law by Gamaliel. and he was the leading rabbi of the first century. He served as a prominent Pharisee and head of the Sanhedrin, which was like the Jewish ruling body. So it made him one of the most authoritative Jewish teachers at the time. So to be trained by him was a really big reason to boast. So boasting was commonplace. And it was a little bit like publicly announcing your CV, but with adding on lots of extra things as well. Well, Paul's opponents back in 2 Corinthians made their claims over the Corinthians, and they made claims of being superior to Paul in terms of the conventional list of achievements about which they could boast. These are the type of boasting that Paul mentions in verse 18. And he says, "Since many are boasting in the way the world does, I too will boast." But Paul's boasting is quite different. He boasts in his weaknesses. He boasts of those things that make him look weak and even foolish in the eyes of his opponents. And as well as all those events that he'd listed, which showed him to be suffering for spreading the gospel, he was under daily pressure, anxiety for the churches, daily pressure the whole time. Now, boasting in sort of someone of my generation, and perhaps older generations as well, and particularly in the church, can make us feel a bit awkward and uncomfortable. And it can be regarded as being brash and impolite, showing off, being big-headed. Whereas traditionally, humility and self-effacement were regarded as, nowadays sort of thing, well, my generation, as being more like a virtue. But back then, boasting was the norm, and this is becoming more the trend again in current culture, with sort of social media, influencers plastering their achievements all over sort of multimedia and things. And even things like interviewing prospective teachers and student teachers. Used to be a case of, yes, they'd have their CV and they'd give their basics. But then there was a change, and they'd be giving so much detail and almost bragging about so many different things that sometimes you'd sit there thinking, actually, they're a bit of a big head, really. So attitudes have changed, and it seems to be reverting back to boasting almost becoming norm. But does that mean it's right? Something that used to puzzle me a bit, used to strike me as a bit odd when I was a fair bit younger, was at church, usually at church, somebody might have done something really well, done really good reading, sung something beautifully, whatever it was, they happened to have done really fantastically well, fairly well. And then they were congratulated and told, that's really good, that, well done. You've worked hard on that. And the person would respond, and this is a bit, I always just find a little bit odd, and they'd go, "It wasn't me, it was God." And this just always struck me as being a bit odd, because I'd actually seen that person standing up there and actually doing whatever it was that they'd been congratulated for. And I know what they meant, because they were trying to give the glory back to God, and that's always the right and proper thing to do, because it's God who gives us our talents and our gifts. But it made me also think of, there used to be a Sunday school song, and I've racked my brains and I cannot think of what it is. But it used to be about using your hands to serve God, using your feet, using your lips, using your voice, using your mind, using every part of you to serve God. Because we're the ones who are here physically, and it's God who then gives us the gifts to actually do those things, because he's no longer physically with us. So that was always something that always struck me as a little bit strange. And it's always good to encourage people who have done something well and given something a go, but at the same time acknowledging that all gifts and talents and abilities come from God. And I think it's okay to be pleased when you get some recognition. I think it's a case of getting that right balance between being boastful of our own achievements and being too sort of self-effacing, but to do things in humility before God, recognising that every gift, every ability that we have comes from him. I've got something that you might like to think about in your discipleship groups. Have a think. Is it okay to be pleased with ourselves and tell others about it when we've done something well, or when someone close to us has done something well? Or is that boasting? I sometimes tell people about my wonderful, talented niece and nephew, and just tell them some of their achievements. You know, my nephew's a doctor, his wife's a doctor, my niece is brilliantly, she's musically talented, she's an artist, she's a nurse, she's got all these degrees, and her husband's doing a PhD. He's actually saving the penguins. So, and he really is, that's what he's doing his PhD on. So that's another thing I'm sort of, yeah. But probably the thing I could mostly say about them is that they are, and their husband and wife as well, are lovely, committed Christians who love Jesus, and they seek to follow him in every area of their life. I'm a very proud auntie, I must say. I think, is it wrong to be proud of them? Is it wrong to boast of their achievements? Because the thing is, they would be the very first to say how much it is God who has enabled them to achieve what they have. What do you think? Think to think about in discipleship groups. I did think about making you do a bit of work this morning. I was going to give you all a piece of paper, but I thought, again, you could do this in your discipleship groups. If you had to make a list like Paul did, I wonder what would be on it. Would it be sort of a typical CV with qualifications, employment experience, hobbies, interests? Or would it also include those things which show your relationship with Jesus? Perhaps including some of those things which might show you to be weak or even foolish in the eyes of society. I wonder. I haven't done that yet, but I'm thinking that sometime this week I'll actually sit down and try and make a list. So Paul boasted in the standard way of the time by listing his achievements, but in a way that showed his weaknesses and his reliance on God. His achievements included unpleasant things, as well as those which would make him stand out as an exceptional Jew or apostle. But the thing that really stopped him from becoming too proud, boastful, elated, as chapter 12, 7 onwards tells us, was his thorn in the flesh. I'm just going to read that to you. Even considering the exceptional character of Revelation, therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. I don't know how many of you have had a thorn or a splinter in your flesh, perhaps maybe from gardening. But if you have, you know how very painful it can be, especially if it refuses to come out and it begins to fester. Well, I remember as a child playing with wooden bats with my sister, hitting the ball up against the garage, and my sister hit me accidentally, she says, with her bat, and a slither of wood, and it felt like half a branch had gone, went straight down my thumbnail. And it wouldn't come out. And the more I tried, the worse it got. My mum tried, couldn't get it out. So she cut my thumbnail really, really, really low to try and expose it. So that made it even worse. She couldn't get it out. She soaked it in salty water. And eventually, and I cannot remember how long later, it's a number of days, it began to fester, and finally it came out. So it's horrible having a thorn or splinter. It's uncomfortable, it hurts, it throbs, and you can't think of anything else. It takes up all your attention. I know I found it difficult to focus on other things because when your thumb's throbbing away, you think, just stop. Paul has what he describes as a thorn in the flesh, which was such that it caused him constant discomfort, and it took his mind off from feeling too elated about all those good and worthy things he had done or had received from God. We don't know what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. Over the centuries, people have made various suggestions. Maybe it was an eye problem, mental health issues, spiritual attacks, that the thorns were his opponents, maybe some kind of illness or disability resulting from his frequent floggings and imprisonments. We don't know. And in some ways, it's good that we don't know. Because if we did know, we might think about the difficulties we have in life and think, well, they weren't the same as Paul's, so maybe this bit about grace doesn't apply to us. So it's good that we don't know things sometimes. Whatever it was making his life difficult and possibly painful and uncomfortable and tiring, verse 7 tells us that it tormented him. He pleaded with the Lord 3 times for it to leave him, but it didn't. The response he had from Christ was, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul's response is to boast even more in his weaknesses, because the weaker he is, and the less able he is to resolve problems himself, the less able he is to be able to heal himself, then the more he saw the power of God working in his life. He had to rely on God's grace to cope with the situation. Through his weaknesses, the power of Christ shone through and gave him the strength to endure those things, to live with those things, and as Paul says in verse 10, to be content with weakness, insults, hardship, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Paul was given that promise, but it is also for each one of us who love and follow Jesus. At the heart of this is God's grace. Grace means we are given more than we deserve. We are given what we do not deserve. In fact, we're given so much more. And this is at the heart of the gospel. The grace of God means that though we are all sinners and deserve punishment from a holy God, Jesus took that punishment on the cross, and through his death and resurrection, we can receive that grace and have a relationship with God. We deserved punishment, but we received forgiveness and love, far more than we deserved. We received God's grace. So that is grace. But God doesn't just show us his grace when we first turn to Christ. It is something that he gives us constantly. The Apostle Paul experienced that grace over and over again, and it was that which enabled him to cope with his thorn. The word sufficient can also be translated as enough. My grace is enough for you. And I was so pleased that this morning the song was chosen, My Grace is Enough. When you have enough of something, you don't need any more. You don't need anything else. It is enough. If you've had enough to eat, you don't need any more. You've had enough. So it is with grace. Jesus gives enough grace for us to cope with, to live with our thorns in the flesh. He gives us enough, just the right amount, not too little. Thorns in the flesh come in all shapes and sizes, and probably many of us here have those things in life that are difficult to live with. It might be physical pain, disability, health issues, mental health issues, anxiety, depression, heartbreak, loss, many other things. And we might pray that the things go. Sometimes we might plead with God to release us, to set us free from things, and they don't. They stay with us. They might go on for days, weeks, years, decades, perhaps even a lifetime. But throughout it, Jesus says to you, to me, to all of us, my grace is enough for you. You do not need anything else but to rely on me. Depend on me. I am the one, I am the one who loves you and cares about you far more than you can ever imagine. I know, I understand, and as you look to me and rely on me, and yes, I'll even help you to do that too, if you feel too weak to do that, I will show you such love and grace, and through that, your weaknesses will become strength. But what if we don't accept that grace? The thorns can fester. They can turn to bitterness. They can cause turning away from God. Whereas grace draws us closer to him. And then it helps us to our character to develop and our relationship with Jesus to get closer. And in Romans 5, I'll just read that bit to you. We boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God, and not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. And also we need to think about our response to those who do suffer, perhaps with long-term issues. And perhaps it might make the person a bit grumpy at times. It might make them sort of not always the nicest person to be around. It might make you sort of think, oh, I don't really want to go near that person. They're going to be grumpy. But we have to think about what our response and attitude to those people are, and how much they might need our encouragement, our help, our support, our prayers. If it's a long-term thing, people do need support, and constant support. And as followers of Jesus, it's for us to share that love and support. Oops. Book's flying off. I want to read you a little bit from this book. It's a brilliant book, a little tiny book by someone called Helen Roseveare, which some of you would have heard of. And it's called Enough. There is a wonderful truth that God has enough to supply all our needs, enough for salvation, enough for forgiveness, enough to overcome temptations, enough to persevere in adversities, enough to calm our fears and anxieties, enough grace, enough love, enough power. His supply is sufficient to meet not only all our needs, but the needs of everyone else in the world now and at all times. This is summed up in the promise, "My grace is sufficient for you." That is to say, it is enough. By his grace, we have everything we need to live the life he has planned for us, everything we need to live a life that is pleasing to him. Sufficient grace. That means there is always enough for all our needs. And then the book quotes from somebody called Graham Hobson in a poem. Grace sufficient he'll provide you, grace in just the way you need, grace to save you, grace to guide you, grace from sin to keep you freed, grace that you may stand unmoving, grace in conflict to succeed, grace sufficient, always proving, his is wondrous grace indeed. So through our weaknesses, the power of Christ shines through and gives us the strength to endure those things and to live with those things for his glory.